Okay, yeah. Yeah, thank you all for joining in today. My name is Nagaraj Adve, and this meeting organized with the Teachers Against the Climate Crisis. This talk is organized just a day or two after the latest nuclear disaster in Chamboli district in Uttarakhand. And whether or not it might be connected to climate change, in fact, scientists from the Vadia Institute just went there today. Teams are going there to find out exactly what happened. The fact is that 3 points are relevant. One, we've sort of changed with climate change, we've changed the background conditions that therefore make such events more likely and possibly will become more frequent. Secondly, it calls into question the government's sort of hydropower and development policy in the mountain states, riverine flows, the widening of roads, tunnels, etc. And this is something that's been debated earlier. And thirdly, given that some of this development is happening because of tourism, it raises the question of what might be an alternative job strategy for the mountains, because a lot of the interventions are for well-off tourists. And we need to generate a job strategy that strengthen ecosystems and not weaken them. A role of a teachers group like ours is to sort of join these dots and approach these issues from different multidisciplinary perspectives, but which also foreground questions of gender and class. This group was formed about a year and a half ago. It's a non-funded and non-party collective, and we organized a number of talks last year. Today is the 23rd, and I'd like to thank Dr. Sunita Narain for agreeing to speak today. Before I hand you over to Professor Rajeshwari Raina, member who so kindly agreed to chair, just a brief word about the format. Dr. Sunita Narayan will speak for 40 minutes, and she has subsequent commitments after the talk. And so we'll have a brief question, answer, and discussion after that for about maybe 25 minutes, half an hour or so. So thank you once again, Sunita, for agreeing to speak today. And over to you, Rajeshwari. Thanks.
Thank you, Nagaraj, and a very, very warm welcome from this Teachers Against Climate Crisis group, Sunita, and from me personally. We are well delighted to have you here with us today. It's my privilege to introduce you today. Dr. Sunita Narain, as everybody knows, is the voice of environment and development questions in India, and has been one person who's worked extensively on questions of climate change, and also, not just a question of adapting to or mitigating climate change, but advocating for an equitable global agreement that is not just as countries that have to make changes in the north or in the south, but across the world. Right. Her work on air pollution, water and waste management, industrial pollution has led to an understanding of the need for affordable and sustainable solutions in India, where the challenges, as Nagaraj just mentioned, is to ensure inclusive and sustainable growth. Yeah? She was a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, and in 2016, Time magazine selected her as one of the most influential people in the world. Sunita Narain has definitely been perhaps the most influential person amongst us, talking to us about and influencing our policymakers about a lot of environmental questions, air, water, land, for us, as this group that has Teachers Against Climate Crisis with a pedagogy commitment, one of the major lessons that comes to us from CSE, from the Center for Science and Environment, is their work on the Environment Education Unit. And their Environmental Education Unit has, with their Green Schools program, with the Green Educators Network, and the teachers' conclaves that they hold every year, has helped shape the agenda for many of us. I will also say that last year, CSC celebrated 40 years of its existence. In at least 5 of the talks of these 22 odd talks that we've had in the TACC, the cartoon of this Amigo, Don't Cut This Tree, that has appeared in at least 5 of the talks that we've had. So we know what CSC has done for us, and where your work with Anil Agarwal has actually taught us a lot of fundamental questions that need to be challenged. A very warm welcome to you, Sunita, again, and looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Rajeshwari, and such a warm welcome. Thank you so much. I mean, it has been 40 years of CSE, and actually we celebrated it in the midst of the pandemic, and we had even forgotten about it until a colleague of mine suddenly reminded us, oh, it's been 40 years since our registration. And so we are very sort of, we put out a mail to everyone saying we've completed 40 years, but clearly what the pandemic has taught us is so many lessons that we all need to be so humble about. And we need to remember that as we have gone through this 40-year journey, how little we seem to have actually absorbed of the lessons that we have. And I think that's really what today's pandemic tells us. So I have a presentation, and I'll quickly share my screen and I'll go through it. And I will look forward, of course, to the questions that I get from all the audience. I'm looking forward to them. So I'm talking about the whole issue of climate risk world, as you know. But I'm also putting it in the context of COVID. I mean, today we live in unprecedented times. We have never seen this. And I mean, I keep telling my colleagues this, that this has to be the story of our ages, because the way the economies have collapsed. And the fact is, what we have learned is that it has been the poor who are the worst hit, the disadvantaged, whether they're Black, they're brown, or poor. The poor are most vulnerable, one, because of the fact they live, because of their living conditions, congested homes, dirty surroundings with no water or sewage management. They're also the most vulnerable because of the collapse of the economies. They are suffering, and this clearly is not acceptable. We also need to really talk about this in the context today of the other pandemic, other catastrophe, which is actually awaiting us. Because governments seem to have little ability today to handle the normal. And there is then the global catastrophe which is looming and showing up, which is climate change. And we need to understand that this challenge of climate change is not going to go away. It's going to make our world even more vulnerable to shock and to disruption, and to the kind of disruption that we've seen of these past years, of this past year. We are going to see many more such shocks because of climate change. Scientific evidence, and I don't need to say it to this group of such informed people, but just to reiterate the point that it's unequivocal that there is climate change. Attribution, of course, is easy to dismiss. We always hear this, that bushfires have always happened, floods and droughts always happen, cyclones always happen, locust attacks always happen. Today you will hear that, why are you making this connection between climate change and the flood that has happened yesterday, last night in Uttarakhand? I mean, the Himalayas, floods have always happened. So why are we linking it to climate change? I think what is very clear, and what is, we need to be very careful in how we therefore speak about this, is that the intensity and frequency of these events is no longer in the normal range of variation. And I think that's the point that we need to be able to emphasize in each case. If you look at cyclones, we are seeing more unusual patterns, more frequency, but also changes in intensity and predictability of the event. I mean, today, Indian scientists are calling it the rapidification of the cyclones, the increased unpredictability of the cyclones, simply because of the change in the temperature between the land and the sea is actually reduced. And the warming ocean is making the cyclone much more unpredictable. And that's really the link with climate change. But there are also links that are often hidden, and some things that we never talk about. I mean, I wrote this last year, sometime at this time in January. I remember writing an editorial saying we were reading about the bushfires in Australia at that time. And, as Indians, we were making the connection between the bushfires and climate change. And yet there was something happening in our own backyard, which we weren't making the link with climate change, which was the locust attacks. And that was a massive attack of locusts that was destroying the fields of already very poor farming communities. And we weren't being able to join the dots between those attacks and climate change. So I think it's very important for us to understand and then be able to neither understate nor overstate the problem, but yet be able to make the link. Because these links have to be explained your educators, and I'm particularly emphasizing this, they need to be understood and explained so that we have an informed public opinion. It should not be an opinion which is just based on some general facts. Today is an intensely political but scientific issue of climate change. Let's take locusts. We know that these are desert creatures that multiply exponentially when conditions are right. So it's the right conditions that we are talking about. It's the rain in the desert conditions, unexpected, prolonged, so that it created the right conditions for multiplication. Vegetation, because of the greenery in the desert, it created vegetation. Food, which otherwise would not have been there, and the insects would have multiplied and then died, but this created the conditions for multiplication, and of course the higher temperatures, which was right for their movement and growth. And so if you look at this, and something we put out in Down to Earth last year, which is, look at the unusual weather patterns in Arabia. You had these different cyclones, and the Arabian Peninsula, which had such rain that lakes were formed in the desert. And that's when the locusts found the right conditions for breeding. And it was exponential. And then you saw this movement. Again, if you start tracking the movement of the locusts with the temperature and, more importantly, the unseasonal rainfall, you start joining the dots that you got unseasonal rainfall both in the Horn of Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula, you got a prolonged monsoon in India, and all that created the right conditions for the locusts to breed. And as a result of it, you basically created huge swarms of locusts, which led to massive impacts on farmers in our countries, and still not well documented. It's the same thing with climate change and cyclones. We know that we've got, we have today, and I think we should be very clear about this, that the ability to forecast cyclones in India has really improved, and that's fantastic. And we have seen the number of deaths as a result go down every time there is a cyclone warning. We've seen evacuation happen. But the fact is that today the evidence is showing that the intensity is increasing. But as I said, they're also becoming much more unpredictable, and therefore causing much more long-term ecological and livelihood damage. And that's the point that we need to be able to understand, this double whammy between extreme rain, the floods, and the fact that we are now getting more and more extreme rain in the country. I mean, this is a clear attribution to climate change. Today, the IMD is putting out data that shows us how extreme rain events have gone up. And as a result of it, in a country like India, which in any case, it rains for a limited number of hours in a year, you are basically beginning to see more rain in fewer number of rainy days in fewer hours. And that leads to massive flooding. And of course, then it leads to increased cycle of flood and drought. But we also have to talk about the fact that this is part of that double whammy, because it's also the mismanagement of the land, the mismanagement of our forest resources, mismanagement of our water resources, which is first making us vulnerable, and then comes climate change. It's the same thing that has happened with the landslide in the Himalayas yesterday. I mean, the landslide in the Himalayas, from what we can understand, is part of the natural vulnerability of the Himalayas, the youngest mountain range in the world, which is naturally prone to avalanche and landslides. You have then a combination on it, the destruction that we are doing because of the dam building, because of the roads, because of all the things that we are doing mindlessly in a very fragile ecosystem. And on top of that, what is coming out clearly is that climate change is leading to the slow melting of the glaciers. Therefore, more water leading to more instability in the mountain range. That combination of the three is what you are seeing today with the devastation that you have seen. So at all times, we need to keep in mind all three. The local ecosystem, what we are doing, and then of course, the increased vulnerability because of climate change. Now, in all this, it is the human face that we need to keep in mind, the internal displacement. The fact is, the flood, drought, crop loss, cyclone are not single day events. They cripple people, they destroy livelihoods, they take away the development dividend. And as the events become more frequent, survival becomes more difficult. Therefore, people have no option but to move, to migrate to different cities, to new countries. And that really is the human face of the devastation we are seeing. But please keep in mind, I am not linking this only to climate change. I am not calling them climate change refugees. They're as much because of the mismanagement of our natural resources as it is about the increased risk because of climate change. We had put out this data on internal displacement. What is interesting is to see is that what you're getting is today now more data on what is being called new displacement, which is actually taking over the displacement from conflicts. And it's now because of the new displacement that the data from across the world is being able to put together to show us that that's making the world much more vulnerable. And that's really why people are beginning to migrate more and more. Now, this is where the COVID-19 story needs to be put into context. I mean, this is the kind of pincer movement that we saw this last year. I mean, when I think about this last year of COVID, and I wrote that we must not forget 2020. It's a nightmare. It's a year that we'd like to erase from our memories, but we must not forget it. And we must not forget it because of the face of the worker that we saw, where the city turned their back on the worker and they had to leave. And you saw massive migrant movement, not just in India, but across the world, where people were earlier desperate to leave their homes because of poverty, lack of livelihood, climate risks. Now they were desperate to return. And that then raised the very fundamental issue on what is the future of work? What is the future of production? And I think this then is some of the COVID challenges which will help us to actually understand the climate challenge even better. We know climate change is real. I don't need to talk about it, but I need to be able to tell you that no country in the world has learned to get rich without emissions yet. The US is moving from coal to gas. It's still a fossil fuel. If you look at their energy transition, and even now with President Biden coming in, and definitely it's a relief over President Trump, who denied even the problem of climate change. The fact is, even President Biden is talking about shale gas to continue, not on federal lands, but on private lands. And in fact, shale gas exploration is largely in the private lands. EU coal use in electricity is still as high as its RE-based electricity, a point that is often missed out when we talk about the EU. US will not even meet its Paris Agreement commitments, and these, please remember, are not even proportional to the contribution of the problem to the stock of emissions in the atmosphere. What is even worrying is that transport emissions are increasing. So even as countries like the United States have actually managed to bend their energy emissions, which is big, but they have bent it because they have moved from coal to gas, and therefore a 50% reduction from coal to gas, or a transition, means a 30% reduction in the total emissions. But the US emissions are not decreasing at the scale because emissions in other sectors are going up, and primarily in the transport-related sectors. And emission gains are being negated, energy transformation is not happening. Now, this really then raises the biggest challenge of climate change, because climate change is about gases which survive long in the atmosphere. And therefore, it is about sharing the growth between nations. If it was about particulate emissions, which actually survive for a day or two in the air, then it's about local emissions and it's about local air pollution. But the reason climate change becomes such a vast problem and such a serious problem for countries across the world is because it is about long-lived gases. And therefore, the emissions that were emitted in the past have as much importance in the future as anything else. So this is really why the question with climate change is about sharing the growth between nations. You know this, the emissions equals concentrations, equals temperature rise, and that then brings you to what can be called the carbon budget. The budget which we have in the world for every human being in the world if we want to stay below a certain temperature rise. 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees, we know how much carbon budget do we have. And that carbon budget then has to be shared across the world, across the human beings. Now, if you look at the budget, what the world can emit to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade, IPCC says that for a 66% chance, you can afford to emit between 420 to 570 gigatons between 2018 and the end of the century. But if you look at this data, and the bottom line in this is that at current rates, the world will exhaust the entire budget for the century in this decade itself. So by 2030, there will be no budget left to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And that then raises the very big question: what happens to the poor in the world who still do not have access to energy? So if you look at this, this is the historical budget of the world. And you look at the United States, and you can see very clearly here that the US, one single country, has emitted 21% of the stock of greenhouse gases between 1850 to 2011. And if you look at India, it was 2.8, but look at China, important because I'm going to come back to you in terms of how China has actually appropriated the carbon budget in the next phase. So that was, till 2011, it was about 10% was China. But if you look at it from this perspective now, and if I give you this data, which basically tells you what is the future inequity, future carbon budget. So this is percentage of the CO2 budget between 2012 to 2030. And this is the carbon budget, therefore, what will be taken up by countries between 1850 to 2030. Now, if you look at this, the US actually as a proportion comes down to about 17%, because in this period of 2011 to 2030 with its NDC, it will still consume. And this is where the US should have reduced, but it will still emit and it will still take up another 10% of the carbon budget. Overall, between 1870 to 2030, its percentage will be 17%. China will go to 16% because it will consume in this period about 30% of the budget. If you look at India, we will remain at about 4%. We will take up another 6.8%. We will still remain 4%. And remember, what I'm basically saying is that by 2030, the world, if it wants to stay below 1.5 degrees centigrade, a guardrail, a safety guardrail, then there is nothing left. And if you look at the proportion of countries with large populations like India, we get a minuscule share of that carbon budget at our current rates of emissions. And that's where you get this extremely unjust world between 2012 to 2030. You look at this per capita emissions, China will be, and I think that's why the Chinese, this was the Obama-China deal. It was a very clear, well-crafted deal where both China and the US will actually have parity on a per capita basis, 11.9 and 11.9. But if you look at Nigeria, it will still have 1 ton per capita. If you look at India, we will have 3 tons per capita. So this is the inequity in the world, which is now getting frozen. This is the climate apartheid, which is now getting done. And this is really the question that we have to ask the world, that how will you wish away the poor? The budget will be over. The world will be on course for increasing temperatures, but what does it mean for the poor? Large numbers of people in India, Africa, South America, what will it mean for them? Will they stop development? Will we stop breathing, eating, cooking, studying, working? How will we grow? I mean, there will be huge pressures on us, but the fact is, what are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to stop everything? The price of mitigation, it's very easy to say, let's just move to solar, let's just move. No country in the world has moved actually to renewables. They have done a transition to gas or to cleaner, other cleaner fuels like nuclear or hydro. So will they get richer like us? And as they get richer, as the poor countries get richer, they will emit and temperatures will increase. And so therefore the whole world will be at risk. This is the COVID lesson that we need to speak about with climate change, that we live in an interdependent world, that if the poor do not get access to their share of the carbon budget, and if the agreement is not built on cooperation, and they do not get access to ways in which they will be able to reduce, then the whole world will be at increasing risk. And as I keep saying, and I write this often, that words are cheap, transformation is not. If you look at the cost of transformation, it's very clear that the cheapest options, which everybody is looking for today, is really in land-based options. And that's really where the new buzzwords are coming up in the world called net zero. Emit but clean up. If you look at it, all countries are putting up, and China has also put out its net zero target. What does net zero mean? Net zero means that we will emit, but we will soak up the emissions both in forests or pump it back into the ground or buy it from developing countries. So essentially, you're coming up with tools in which you can continue, your lifestyle is not negotiable, and that you will continue to emit, and that you will find ways of being able to deal with your emissions. And these are where the new games are afoot. I mean, at the end of the day, forests of the poor are the cheapest options to do carbon sequestration. That's what data shows. Of course, the methodology of calculating sequestration is extremely suspect, but nevertheless, if you look at all the net zero targets, I was reading yesterday or day before that somebody was buying oil, which is net zero. I mean, it's such an oxymoron to call oil net zero oil. But that's because somebody has gone and bought some carbon credit somewhere to plant some trees, and so they have made the oil net zero. Now, this is where the big issue for the future will come. Forests are not wilderness. They are habitats and livelihoods of the poor. And if we can make this work, we have to make it work by paying the cost of growing trees to people. But that's not what the world is looking for. They're looking for cheap options. So if the world is serious about net zero, then they need to reduce emissions domestically and pay the price for emission reduction in foreign lands, the real price in the hands of very poor communities where the habitats are of forests. But this then brings you back to COVID. And this is really where we must learn the interconnectedness of the world, the interdependence of the world. COVID has moved with speed across nations, cities, villages, because we are interconnected. The movement of people and goods between nations, between nations and within nations is massive. We also have understood with COVID that we are as strong or as weak as our weakest link. And if the virus remains in any region, any country, the contagion will spread. Today, we are learning that even if you can vaccinate the rich, the fact is that if mutation happens, and if the virus remains and mutation happens, it's a race between mutation and vaccination. So we need to be able to provide for all. And this really means learning the interconnectedness and interdependence, both for climate change and for COVID. It's the same for climate change, same for air pollution. And this really is where I keep making the point that all of these tell us that they're great equalizers. Because when it comes to air pollution, we have also understood if the poor do not get access to clean energy, they will use polluting fuels to cook food or build livelihoods. And this will contaminate the airshed of the rich and the poor. So you have to talk about affordable growth for it to be sustainable growth. It has to be equitable for it to be sustainable. And this is so important for us to keep emphasizing, because I find that in this very technocratic view of environment, we often miss the politics of environment. We often miss this connection between the politics of environment and the politics of equity in and inequity. And this really comes out so clearly in everything we do. I mean, I find I'm not a very, I don't like hyperbole. I'm very focused on what we are doing. And when I've looked at air pollution or I've looked at shit in our rivers, in each case, it's come back to the fact that I need an affordable growth model for it to be sustainable. I won't get into air pollution because we have a lot of work we have done on this, but I just want to talk about the dystopian relationship that we have with nature, which COVID has taught us, which is that that humans we know are transgressing the nature-human boundary. We are destroying our forests, and we are transforming nature through our industrial food systems, our methods of growing food, the animals, the production systems that we have, the way we are destroying biodiversity, which is making breeds less resilient. We have in Down to Earth have just done a cover story looking at the avian flu. And again, it brings us to the poultry industry, things that we don't want to talk about, and how this is making us more vulnerable to zoonotic diseases. And the reason I'm emphasizing this here is that it's important for us as we talk about climate change to make the connections between the mismanagement of the environment, the growing vulnerability when we look at COVID-19, and therefore the interlinkages between that and the next big disaster that is awaiting us, which is climate change. Now, in all this, therefore, the question becomes, what do we do? How do we begin to reshape our world? And this, I think, has some interesting and exciting lessons for the future. I talked about this to you earlier, that the future of work is up today for questioning. When people left their villages because of agrarian distress or climate change, they were now desperate to return. And therefore, there is a big opportunity here to invest in resilience, building resilience of local rural economies. And this then becomes one of those massive opportunities where you can both fix climate change, but you can also fix the issue of agrarian distress. We need to think out of the box and at scale, something we're just not doing. We need, as I said, to reinvest in rural economies. We need to rethink conservation and productivity, because we as environmentalists have just swung pendulums between extraction, which is destroy everything, or conservation, which is do not touch. And I can give you my personal experience. I was a member of the committee looking at the Himalayan dams in 2013. It was a planning commission committee. And I was faced with, on one hand, dam builders who were basically saying, we want to build run-of-the-river projects back to back. It was as if they were building a shopping mall in GK back to back on the Himalayas. And they didn't think that there was any stop to extraction. But on the other hand, there was also my own community of people who were there, who were basically saying no dams. Every dam is bad and cannot be built. Now, the fact is that water is one of the biggest resources of the Himalayas. If you take away forest, you take away water from the Himalayas, you actually have no model of development for the Himalayas. You also are very clear that the local people in the Himalayas require jobs. And hydroelectricity is still one of the cleaner sources of electricity as compared to many other sources, including coal. So in all this, there was a question of what would you do? And and I'm digressing here from what I've written, but only to put this point because it's so top on my mind right now, having seen the tragedy yesterday and going back to some of the papers I wrote at that stage, was that you could come up with a model that said, how would you build the dam so that you would respect the ecological flow of the river? You would mimic the ecological flow of the river. And therefore, no dams would be built unless you would first respect the flow of the river and then plan the dam. But as you were caught in these two communities, no dams, all dams, you ended up with never being able to come up with any principle which would actually make sure that you could do a certain amount of development in the Himalayas, but make sure that it met the needs of communities and yet also could be sustainable. It's the same thing with agriculture. Today we have farmers on our doorstep. We know that we have only one model of agriculture, which is a high input agriculture, which adds to risk. And in times of climate change and weird weather will increase debt. We need to consider low input but high value resource management. But we need to be able to put money in the hands of the producer. And we need to be able to link food to nutrition. We are not doing that today. We are not even talking about the real cost of growing food to farmers, and therefore they are in desperation. And this is the geography we need to change. This is the geography of rich lands, poor people that needs to be changed. And therefore we then have, and I'm going to come to an end here, we really have the question of the future of production, which is a big issue today. I mean, we talk about pollution and we talk about this very glibly, and we talk about it without understanding that we've inherited or have built a model of globalization in which economies are forced to discount the cost of labor and environment. Trade has moved to countries which can compete because of low costs, including not paying the cost of cleaning up. And this is really where the big challenge of the future, both for climate change as well as all economic growth lies. I mean, the fact is, you cannot deal with air pollution or water pollution, industrial water pollution in India, because every time you crack down on industries which are in the legal industrial area, you raise the regulatory cost of pollution control, and the industries simply move to where the regulations do not exist. They move to unauthorized areas. They move to villages. We see this again and again and again. The number of unauthorized illegal industries which are not on government records are 10 times, and I'm saying this figure very carefully with full knowledge, are 10 times higher than the legal industries. And this is where the pollution is coming from. But the only reason industries do this, not because they want to break the rules, not because we are brown and so we are corrupt or any other silly reason that people will give you. It is because of the model of globalization in which those costs cannot be paid. So now today, can we start talking about, when we talk about environment, when we talk about labor coming back, can we pay higher cost for development, cost for the goods? Will this make our economies less dependent on consumption-led growth, more on well-being-led growth? It's $1 million question, and it cannot be answered by one country because every country is in a race to the bottom. So we have to be able to talk about this to ask that these really become the big questions for the future. And this really is what I talked about. You cannot fix urban air pollution unless you change the rules of the game. Today, we just have finger pointing. You blame the farmers, you blame dust, simple, two people who can't stand up and argue. We have definitely made progress, but we need transformational response. And that transformational response will come out of the investment in clean fuel for industry, for power plants. The cost of coal is so cheap and gas is heavily taxed, electricity is unreliable. We need to invest in clean fuel for households, which is for cooking needs. Government is doing this, But the fact is, all the Ujjwala program of government is showing that the first cylinder is subsidized. People take it, they welcome it, but then they don't have the money to pay for the second cylinder, because monetized energy requires enough cash in the household to pay for meeting a need which is seen to be not so important. It's part of the wicked problems of the world, something that a woman has to deal with, and therefore it's really not needed when you have an unmonetized source of energy that is available. You also need to invest in public transport at scale. But again, we need to be clear that the challenge is to find solutions for the poor who cannot even afford a bus ticket, and for the rich together. And that's really the challenge. So we need affordable solutions for it to be sustainable. We talk about public transport very glibly and not understanding this challenge of poverty, which makes it clear that a bus transport system in India needs to be cheap enough for the poor, yet modern enough and convenient enough for the rich to take. It's the same for water, same for waste. If technology cost is unaffordable, it cannot be sustainable. We also know that water is a crucial determinant for health. Availability of clean water is connected to our ability to treat human and industrial waste. Today, we are failing this in spite of government programs, interventions, and technologies. We are failing it because we fail to recognize our reality. CSE does what is called shit flow diagrams. We basically map the excreta flow in our cities to understand the policy and practice implications. And if you look at what we find that in most of our cities are not connected to a sewage system. They have what is called as an on-site treatment system. Toilets are connected to soak pits or connected to drains or septic tanks with no underground lining. And excreta is transported from these tanks and drains to river or any drain, which then makes its way to a river. Now, this is our reality. This is why we continue to have such high levels of pollution in our river, because we don't recognize this reality. We are basically intercepting the underground sewage of our city and taking it to a sewage treatment plant. But the bulk of our city is not even connected to an underground sewage system. This is what our shit flow diagrams, we did them city after city, will show you. Now, the reality then is our opportunity. The majority of households are not connected to an on-site system, but these systems are cost effective. So instead of government planning to build an underground sewage system, you can actually accept these as a reality and accept the fact that here people are managers, because if the septic tank overflows, people will get a backflow, they will call and get it cleaned, and they already exist. We do not have to re-engineer entire cities for sewage network. And this is the example that we have of the past, the landline of the mobile. 20 years ago, we were building landlines to connect people. Today, we go through the satellite. 10 years ago, we were building energy grids. Today, in different parts of the world, not so much in India, people are installing solar systems on rooftops. So we can jump, skip, and leapfrog in landline and grid route. Why not in sanitation? And this is also good for us because you reuse and reinvent for land. Today's water sewage system is actually water-based. We use water for flush, and then we basically end up with destroying the nitrogen cycle of the world, because the nutrients are lost, food security is lost, water is polluted. It's a system that we inherited from parts of the world where there is a lot of water, where they were dealing with problems of cholera, and they basically ended up with creating a water-based sewage system to use water to flush a little bit of human excreta. But if you could actually reinvent it and think about a circular economy in the true senses, you could use excreta as nutrients for soil. You would reuse it in agriculture or compost. So it means that you use modern technology to remove pathogens, deliberately design it for reuse, and you basically combine compost, you can make pellets, whatever. You can basically, you have to think out of the box, as I said, reinvent the paradigm, think about our reality and plan for it. And this is then the final point that I want to make, is that today's world is about science and it needs informed understanding. Every policy is about knowledge of science and its application in technology. But it's as much about science as it is about the politics of science, whether it comes to food, to water, to air pollution. And we need the engagement of your community, the educational, the scientific community in the multiple crises that face us, that stare us in the face today. But most of all, it needs all our ability to push for solutions, to be bold, imaginative, and at all times to find answers that work for all. The bottom line is it cannot be sustainable if it is not inclusive, equitable, and affordable by all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a really interesting. I really liked the way you emphasize the need to understand these interlinkages. And well, I have a question about that, about how we get to this understanding of linkages and how that is conveyed to policymakers, or more importantly, to scientists and to academics. But my question, I think, can wait. I just wanted to ask if we could take about 20-25 minutes for Q&A. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, 20 minutes.
You're tight.
That would be nice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few questions here. I'm just going to quickly read a couple of them. So one is about this dam, that is dams that can be constructed if we respect the flow of the river. The question is, well, a dam by definition is a denial of the flow of the river. So how do we do this as ecologically respecting the river and then constructing a dam? A related question is about Nagaraj's question, which is specifically about natural gas versus coal, which you mentioned. Setting up gas distribution infrastructure is expensive, and two, we will become import dependent. But even then, natural gas is perhaps far less polluting than coal. Millions die each year due to coal burning. So Nagaraj is asking you to share your thoughts about this aspect of energy transition.
So let me take the first question on the dam issue. I mean, see, there is no doubt a dam impedes the flow of the river. And so you can always argue that itself is bad and don't do it. I mean, I have no problems with that. I just don't think that voice is going to be heard today. So I think that that is something that, you know, we need people who will say all development is bad, no dams on any river should be allowed. I have no problems with that. That is the right of people to be able to argue, and that I respect that right completely. From my point of view, I can only speak from my understanding. I know that hydroelectric projects will be built. There was a big talk about storage-based dams in the Himalayas. Terry became a big issue, which is where the whole question of run-of-the-river projects came in. Run-of-the-river projects are essentially projects where you have a head. You don't divert the river water to store it. You basically use the head to create energy, and you leave the water in the river itself. And these were seen to be more benign. The problem has been the number of projects that are coming up and the design of the river. I mean, if you look at the data that I got in 2013, when I was a member of the BK Chaturvedi Committee on Dams in the Himalayas, the government itself admitted that 70% of the Ganga would be affected, which means that you would actually be building dams on 70% of the rivers. And the dam was constructed back to back. Now, the argument could be don't build anything. My argument was come up with a very clear way in which you would first respect the river flow and then plan the dams. And that meant that you would reduce the number of dams, you would reduce the amount of hydroelectricity that you would generate. I also argued that the first right of that hydroelectricity should be to the local people who live in the Himalayas, because the irony of our electricity generation has always been that we export the electricity, and the people who live closest to whether it's coal-based power plants or hydel plants do not get it. So I argued that this had to be done. I created a formula for the government, which would mean that you would essentially mimic the river flow. And we re-looked at the number of dams, and we said how many dams would have to be cancelled as a result of this philosophy of mimicking the river flow. And also we came up with the distance criteria. Now, all that was clearly not good for the dam construction people, nor good for the people who said no dams. And as a result of it, the committee report was not accepted because it was, I mean, I gave a dissenting view in any case, but it was not accepted because it was seen to be, it didn't go far enough for either side. And as a result of it, you've had a reversal, and all dam projects have been allowed now. So no principle is agreed. So I, as an environmentalist, I'm very clear about this. This is what I do. This is how I speak. I'm not speaking for anyone else. But our research tells us that we will have to balance environment and development, and we will have to find a way in which environment gets precedence and the needs of the poor gets precedence. And that's really what we argued for in the committee. Now, that's my point of view, not to be accepted as the only point of view, but it's my point of view. As far as Nagaraj's question is concerned, CSC is very clear. We have been asking for gas to be used in interim fuels. We asked this for CNG. We are the ones who pushed CNG in Delhi when it came to local air pollution. We said that it was an important thing. We are also asking for gas today for power plants. We're asking for it for industry. But let me make it very clear to Nagaraj that whatever the government says, the problem today is not the pipelines or the availability of gas, it's the taxation on gas. And we have put out a pre-budget. We had put out a letter to the finance minister asking the finance minister to include gas in GST and giving her data how gas is taxed, is so heavily taxed, and coal is not. So we had compared gas to coal, and we had said that gas and coal, there is a big difference in taxation. And we had argued that particularly what is called the Gujarat tax or the Maharashtra tax, which is an 18% tax or VAT on the gas which is landed in the ports of Gujarat and Maharashtra. Basically, we had said mixed gas too expensive. Now, the government is still not prepared to make gas part of GST. I'm sure they have a plan. I mean, the Prime Minister even yesterday has talked about India as a gas-based economy. They're very wise people. I'm sure they have a plan on how they will make expensive gas affordable for large numbers of people.
Thank you. Thanks, Sunita. There are two questions that are specifically about the politics and history of dams. So the first is about Himalayan states and multiple states, governments, countries wanting to build dams across the third pole. Do you see a workable solution? That's one question. And the other one is about a larger institutional and governance limitations. When thinking about solutions like dams. Yeah. So do we move beyond thinking large and start looking at the whole problem differently? And this comes perhaps from not looking at infrastructure, dams as infrastructure, but as agents with histories, invested interests that create them. So that applies to any centralized solution.
Question. I think, Rajeshwari, you will have to call another speaker for that. I am not in that realm of theory. I have no clue about all this. I'm a very practical person and my work speaks for what I do, okay? I can only say to you and I reply to you in a very different way. For me, the governance issue is really about the scrutiny and assessment and the lack of scrutiny and assessment today. I mean, the fact is that we do need a policy for dams in Himalayas, okay? Now, the policy cannot be no dams in Himalayas, which is what I think a large numbers of people would like. Okay, I would wish them luck. I only know that it will not happen. And even if it happens, it will happen. So, I mean, there was a moratorium on all dams construction set by the Supreme Court. It was lifted and all hell broke loose. There was no effort to then bring in. So I think it's very important for us to accept the fact that there is going to be pressure to build dams in the Himalayas. Let's also accept the fact, and this is what I am saying. I don't expect anyone to accept it. I mean, please be clear. Everybody has to accept their own truths, their own understanding. I can only say to what I can say. My understanding is very clear. Hydel projects are still more benign than coal projects. We will require energy in the world, all over the world. Hydel electricity is in fact seen as a renewable energy versus a non-renewable energy. Okay, Himalayas have two major sources of revenue, three major sources if you want to put it. There is the forests of the Himalayas, there is the water in the Himalayas, and there is tourism in the Himalayas. Now, there are people who live there, there are states over there, they will need to optimize on their resources, on their natural resources as well. We cannot simply say to them that unless we are willing to compensate them completely and say that don't touch your forest, don't touch your water, and we will compensate you for living in a pristine environment. Don't have jobs there, come to our cities for jobs, let all the parties in any case move, they're moving. So villages are getting more and more abandoned. You can say they can all move to cities. Let's use the Himalayas just as a pristine landscape where we have no development at all. It's a possibility, but then India needs to have a policy again for being able to compensate both the state as well as the people adequately, not what we are doing under the Finance Commission, which is just inadequate compensation for the cost of forests which are not touched. Okay, so I think we need to have a clear policy on dams, and we need a clear policy on the Himalayas. The sad thing, Rajeshwari, which I feel is, I think we have lost the imagination of the Himalayas. I mean, since yesterday, suddenly the Himalayas is back. But if you think about it, for all of us, and I'm too old in this, we've grown up with the Chipko movement, looking at Alaknanda, talking about the Virendra Kumar committee report. You know, there was so much talk about the Himalayas. There was so much talk about the role of the Himalayas as a protector, as a, you know, as the one barrier that India has, the way it modulates our weather systems. We talked about the Himalayas in terms of the high value agriculture that is needed. Somehow Himalayas has lost imagination of, I mean, it's just not in our narrative. And the only time we think of the Himalayas is when there is a flood like this, or the Badrinath floods, and you suddenly had large numbers of pilgrims caught there. So I think we need some of these things. We need to understand why these ecosystems are actually losing out in our narrative, in our consciousness, not even narrative, but our consciousness. Now, I think for me, the question of governance is important, if I may emphasize that, because to me, the question is not the number of dams. The question is who scrutinized the number of dams. Now, when I was on this committee, I had Roorkee University, IIT Roorkee, which fudged the data and gave it to me. Fudged the data. They actually fudged the data. And I wrote about this publicly. I wrote about it and informed the chairman, B.K. Chaturvedi, that this data is fudged, that you cannot accept it. But at least I could do that in 2013. I could raise the point. Since then, these committees have become closed. Everybody basically says anything that can clear the projects. There is no scrutiny, there is no assessment. And as a result of it, there is really no evaluation or that is given whether this dam is going to be good for the Himalayas or bad for the Himalayas. And I think, to me, that is the larger question that this Himalayan disaster should be picking up, is our inability to be able to assess the projects and the forums of decision making, scrutiny, assessment, how closed they have become, and how full of, I mean, we did a story in Down to Earth on the coal mining and the number of projects that were cleared by the government for coal mining and the forest clearances given. And the processes are so, I mean, there is no scrutiny of the process of the clearance at all. I mean, you can literally change the data here and there and clear every project. Now, this is really where you're getting into bad decision making. This is bad governance, because you want good decision making. I have no problems with government saying that, listen, we don't want activists in our decision making. We want our scientists and our academics and our bureaucrats to take careful, conscious decisions. That's perfectly justified. But the question is there a space for those scientists to be able to put forward their point of view? And if that point of view is actually heard, recorded, and acted upon?
No, thank you. And that was a brilliant answer for a question that you said you did not have an answer for. Thank you very much. No, it is actually a difficult decision for many of these state governments, and I mean, like you said, the sources of revenue for what is considered a very important development demand. I mean, so my question is actually, that was one of the first questions that I typed in, was about this well, let's say, the scientists and academics who make this, or let's say, who feed decisions. So one, we are so discipline bound, and two, we are asked repeatedly, for instance, whether it's IIT Roorkee or CSIR, or all these organizations are asked repeatedly to cater to a particular development agenda, which demands these constructions, right? So how do they, I mean, IIT Roorkee fudging the data? Yes, I remember that. I mean, you did write about it. And again, we did discuss this. ICAR recently put out a notice on their webpage saying that all agricultural scientists, students and faculty in state agriculture universities and ICAR support the government and the farm bills. Yeah, they withdrew it, they retracted it the next day, but it was up on their webpage for 24 hours. Where does science work for, well, let's say, think for the environment, for instance, the ecological flow of the river?
Again, to me, I mean, what ICR did, they did. What scientists do, they do. To me, it's a question of, you've had this disaster yesterday, and now it's very clear that dam building in the Himalayas is going to be hit for a while, okay? Because you are going to get, after all, these are investors who are there. People have lost their lives. We need to pay, that's so sad to hear about the number of people who've lost their lives, who are working there. And these dams, there is going to be a question mark on it. It's happened with a lot of other things. Now, to me, this is where, instead of doing this extract, or conserve, you need the ability to take careful decision making. But that careful decision making requires scrutiny. It requires independence. It requires credibility. Now, this is where all governments have to think that what are they going to do to create the space for that? They can do it internally. I have no issues about it. You can do that internally. But if you don't have scrutiny and you only have cheerleaders in government, it won't suit government itself. It won't suit industry itself. I think that's the point we have to make, that unless, I mean, today, let's look at it from COVID, another thing that we are all obsessed about. We are all in it. I mean, today it comes out, the Lancet comes out that Sputnik, the Russian vaccine, is actually quite effective. Now, why did Russia face such a backlash? Because Russia is seen to be, they don't put out data in the public. They have no credibility. Why is no Chinese vaccine? I'm sure they're equally effective. Why are they not being even treated? Well, they're not, their data is not there. Why is it that our own indigenously made vaccine, there was questions raised on it? Because we don't put the data out publicly. So I think it's important for us to understand that we will need more democracy, we will need more credible institutions as we move forward. Of course, it is tough for governments. We have a very, very difficult time in the world today. All governments are getting to feel more under pressure. They have too many threats, too many crises to deal with. And they're all learning and they're all dealing with it in their own way by basically becoming more intolerant, which is understandable. All governments will do that. I mean, the US is doing it. It's not as if we are any different from other countries. But the fact is that it won't serve us well when it comes to crises, and we have climate change as one of the biggest threats which is facing us today. And that will require more democracy, more openness, more credibility, more strengthened institutions of scrutiny.
Thank you. Thanks, Sunita. Yes, I completely agree with that. Yeah. You know, there's just this one last question typed here. May I just quickly ask that? Is that?
Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So this question from Brian Kumar about requesting you to elaborate on your statement that present-day economies discount the cost of labor and nature, especially in the age of globalization. Would you, Mayank's asking if you will elaborate on that?
So I was asked about 2 years ago by the High Court of Delhi to be an amicus in a case on blue jean dyeing in an unauthorized colony of Delhi called Shiv Vihar. So I went to Shiv Vihar. There was a lot of pressure from the High Court because these blue jeans were being dyed. The water was getting contaminated. There was a lot of talk about diseases in that area. There wasn't enough data, but there was anecdotal talk of the amount of cancer and others. So there was concern by the High Court on it. And as a result of it, High Court had a case, asked me to intervene and look at and see what to do. By the time I went to Shiv Vihar, because of the case of the High Court, the factories in Shiv Vihar had been closed down. So all the factories in Shiv Vihar had been closed down. But when I looked at I looked down and I found there was a lot of blue water still in the drain. So I said, but there is water, there's rain, there's still something. So I said, let's track the water. So we started tracking the drains. We reached the same factory, which we found the door on this side the door said closed because of Supreme Court order. But then we followed the drain and we found that the door of that same factory opened on the back side. And that door and the factory continued to work and to dye jeans in these really unhealthy conditions where there is absolutely no worker protection and there is absolutely no environmental protection. Now, I asked, how is this happening? And they said, madam, इस तरफ का दरवाजा दिल्ली में खुलता है, उस तरफ का दरवाजा यूपी में खुलता है. तो फैक्ट्री बिल्कुल लीगल है क्योंकि उस तरफ से हम एंटर करते हैं, हमारी फैक्ट्री यूपी में है, दिल्ली में नहीं है. So the factory was working in an unauthorized colony of Delhi where the side of the door opening in Delhi was closed, the side of the factory opening in UP was open, and everybody continued business as usual. And let's be absolutely clear about this. There is absolutely no protection on worker rights there. People were sleeping inside the factory. The conditions were abysmal. You're dyeing jeans, you have got the worst conditions possible. But what is very clear to you when you look at all that is that the only reason why this will happen is that the cost has to be kept as low as possible. And this is really that discounting of the cost of labor and the cost of environment. Why do you think China excelled? I mean, we don't talk about China today. Why is China today the biggest superpower in the world? Because it has discounted the cost of labor and the cost of environmental protection. And as a result of it, China can produce goods at throwaway rates. Okay? So this is the globalization model, and this is what we are following. And today with Atmanirbhar Bharat, we have to be able to argue back and say, we definitely want a self-reliant India, but it cannot be a polluted self-reliant India. We definitely need a self-reliant India, which is also very clean. And that to me is the big issue which will come up in the future. Can't hear you, Rajesh.
Sorry. This always happens, right?
Yeah.
So for us as this group of teachers against climate crisis, we have smaller working groups that look at questions of environmental curriculum, where we've also looked at much of the work that your CSC's Environment Education Unit has done, and especially the school programs and the Educators Network and so on. But also the small group on environmental justice. I would like you to tell us a little bit about the work that CSE has pioneered, I mean, literally pioneered, on questions of environmental justice in this country. I mean, you've just mentioned this Shiv Vihar case, whether it's the very early work on well, you know, pesticide residue in water. I mean, there's a whole range of environmental justice questions that you've brought out. But what has been the larger lesson for science and for policy making?
I mean, Rajeshwari, I've discussed that in all my lecture. I've talked about climate change injustice. I've talked about the carbon budget.
Yes.
You know that we brought out the global warming in an unequal world way back in 1991. But it's not just that. We have continued on it. I mean, we didn't just bring out that report. And I have to say, it's not artificial to us. Everything I do, I work on air pollution. As I work on air pollution, that lesson of injustice becomes clearer and clearer. I cannot have a public transport system that doesn't work for all. We cannot deal with river pollution unless we have sanitation systems that work for all. So for me, it's very embedded in the not just in the politics of what we do, but also in the work that CSE has done. And everything we do has only helped to reinforce that idea, reinforce that very strong conviction we have that unless we talk about an equitable society, we cannot have a sustainable society.
I mean, since this you also titled your talk as Science and Climate, I just want to know, would you then go on to say that there's something that is let's say missing, that is perhaps inadequate in the ways in which we do our sciences? I mean, since CSE has
the question again, Rajeshwari. We know we are going through. I mean, I can't say how you teach your sciences. I only know what I'm seeing today. I mean, if Roorkee University is fudging its data, it surely cannot be called a center of excellence. Okay? It's certainly teaching its people something about the sciences there. It doesn't gel for me. You know, yeah. I mean, I keep hearing scientific institutions now talking about gender. I keep asking, you cannot have a masculine science and then talk about gender. So I think we also need to somehow raise some of these issues within our scientific institutions to say that the nature of science in India has really become one which is completely disconnected from reality. But that's also the nature of the scientific institutions. They're highly male, they're highly bombastic, they're very arrogant, and in most cases, they're very fossilized as well. I'm sorry, I'm now really at a point of, you know, I'm at it. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And that was wonderful. I just one last question from some of us who've been talking about CSE in 40 years. Do you think the relationship between, well, let's say the state, the nature of the state and the relationship between the state and the civil society organizations, especially in the environmental and also maybe in the development space, has changed? Has the relationship itself changed over time? Is that
it's a very general question. I mean, these things go from issue to issue. I mean, I don't think, I mean, the nature of the state per se may be changing today. And, you know, I mean, it's difficult to say. I mean, we keep doing what we do, Rajeshwari. We keep saying what we say. We have not censored anything that we say. We say what we say. We say it out of rigor, accuracy. We are very clear. We did that in the last government. We did it in the government before. We do it in this government. And that continues to be our character. And I basically have learned now, always, we have a tunnel view. We keep doing what we do. And hopefully someone in society accepts that we do some good and that there is some respect and there is some acceptance of the work we do. But nevertheless, our job is to keep doing what we do.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Sunita. It was a wonderful lecture and also a great discussion following. There have been some of our students who couldn't join us today, but it's been a great opportunity. This will be recorded, so they will listen to the recording and we get back.
No
so if there's any burning question, we'll take a quick question. If there's anybody who really wants to voice a burning question, otherwise we will let Sunita go. She's got to go to a TV discussion. So please, okay. There's a note of thanks from Mayank, very comprehensive treatment of the theme, he says. And for me, the takeaway has been the failure of institutions, So he says the scrutiny of projects has been compromised and perhaps due to lack of participatory form of governance and policy making. Thanks once again. That's from Mayank. And thank you from all of us in the
Thank you,
TACC.
Vinita. Definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Nita.
So-
Thank you.
Very
We'll
enriching.
stay in
Thank you.
touch.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Thomas.
Bye. Thank you.